Hello, Andreas. We would like to talk about detective fiction.
A historical introduction to detective fiction. In 1829, S.S. Blicher is mentioned as one of the founders of crime fiction. In the 1840s, the first pure crime fiction in English-American context was formed. Edgar Allan Poe introduced the Detective Dupin and the Lockroom Mysteries. In 1887, Arthur Conan Doyle created the fictive detective Sherlock Holmes. In the 1920s and 1930s, it was the golden age of crime. It was known for the writers Chesterton, the Knox brothers, and the Queens of Detection, which were Christie, Sayers, and Ellingham. In the golden age of crime, the culprit was always punished and order was restored this way. From the 1930s to the 1940s, the hardball detective genre appears in the US, and this genre is defined by the detective being questionable or violent. In the 1980s and up till today, the postmodern crime story all tamper with the rules of the classic crime story, and the authors Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler are some of the most important. An introduction to the detective crime fiction genre. There are three basic genres: the whodunit, the whydunit, and howdunit. The whodunit is the solving story focusing on the culprit and wants a peace restored. The whydunit is a more psychological focus on the culprit's motive and the crime story. The howdunit is a technical focus about how the crime was committed. The detective crime fiction is a theological genre. It's a story that's driven towards a goal or a solution. The typical detective story has a beginning where the crime takes place, a middle of solving the crime, and is ending with the case solved and peace restored. The main characters in a crime story is always the investigator, the helper, and the detective's friends, the victim, and the culprit. The subgenres include mystery, detective stories, cop shows, police, procedural, forensic shows, and crime stories.
Okay. We got our information in this passage from the text Whodunit by Hannah Olin Anderson. The Golden Age was a time where the stories began to feel more realistic, where the detective is more human. On page 10, line 15 to 16, it says, "The detectives of the period are slightly more human than Dupin and Holmes." So you can actually say that the stories are the realistic. Because it is a type of fiction that takes place in a stable universe, and the story world is stable and reliable. And you can also say that it is the world that's also realistic fiction, because in realistic fiction the characters are involved in events that could actually happen, and the characters seem like real people with real issues solved in a realistic way. Another example that shows us that they were using Todorow's realistic way is, for example, Sherlock Holmes. He uses his cleverness to solve crimes. If we look at page 9, lines 17 to 20, he says, Sherlock Holmes is a omniscient, a genius. He's an expert on any topic from Buddhism in Ceylon via music and art to the human ear. His approach is scientific, and in this way he's product of the optimistic belief in science of his time.
We would also like to talk about Edgar Allan Poe. Poe was one of the first authors to write crime fiction as we know it. He introduced some elements that we typically see in crime fiction. The first and most central element is the omniscient detective. Poe says that the detective is a man of extraordinary intelligence who solves the puzzles using logic. Another element is the detective's friend. Poe says that he functions as a narrator and admirer of the detective. Often he is not the brightest, which makes the detective seem even more intelligent. The unlikely solution is yet another element, and Poe argues that the most unlikely solution is the correct one, and that it is quite obvious once the plot is revealed. Another thing that Poe invented was the locked room mystery. It is a story where a dead body is found in a room that looks like it is completely locked, and Poe first introduced this type of story in his short story Murders in the Rue Morgue. With all of these different inventions, Poe was very influential on the development of detective fiction. And another central person was S.S. Van Dyne. He wrote down 20 rules for detective fiction, but they do not fit all of the stories that we define as detective fiction. For an example, some of the rules are: the reader must have equal opportunity, and the culprit must turn out to be a person who has played a more or less prominent part in the story, none of which apply to Murders in the Rue Morgue. Yet we still define it as detective fiction, so the rule does not apply to all detective fiction stories.
A quick resume. Mr. Pontesbury Wilkins is found hanging from the tree. Police Inspector Blowhard is assigned the case, and he sends the detective Blottersby March. Blottersby March solved the case after an hour of investigation. Open and shut case. Mr. Pontesbury Wilkins was a very hated man, especially by the people close to him. Detective Blottersby comes to the conclusion that it was all of them who did it. They all get hanged, but then at the end it is discovered that Mr. Pontesbury Wilkins worked at the detention, telling him that he intends to commit suicide, and detective will inherit everything he has if he can't make it look as if he was murdered by the householder. In the text, the criminal is actually himself, because he commits suicide, and the victim is Mr. Pontesbury Wilkins. The investigator in the text is Blottersby March, and he tries to solve the murder, and Blottersby gets help from the police inspector Blowhard.
The Murder at the Towers is a parody. The surprising twist on the ending is very unlike other detective stories. It makes fun of the police. They trust whatever the detective says. In this case, the police arrested an entire household and hanged them all just because the detective told them to. The police doesn't even question the detective's conclusion. In other detective stories, the detective is very reliable and does not solve cases for their money but pure interest. In this parody, the detective seems reliable at first but turns out to be unreliable and greedy. The typical structure/composition. All throughout the story, it matches very well with the typical structure, until the end. After the discovery of the killer, the story usually ends with that, but in this case the tension at the end is in fact at peak. The ending leaves the reader very surprised.